Well, great. Welcome. So let's sit for a while. In terms of what to do with that, I would say if you're sitting cross-legged, um, try and fix it so that you feel like the down pressure on your knees is kind of even, and that you have this kind of tripod of support in your lower body where you're solidly planted in all the places where you're planted, basically. Um, and it's probably worth, and this is true also if you're sitting in a chair, it's probably worth rocking back and forth to the left and right, that is to say, and finding the balance point. If you rock slowly to the right, there's this point where the gravity starts to take hold. So if you go the other direction, you feel it. And right in the middle there is your balance point. It might not be absolutely upright, but it's your balance point, which is great. And the same thing is true for rocking forwards and backwards. Just rock at the hips forward until gravity grabs you, backward until gravity grabs you. And then if you find the spot in the middle there, you're about as balanced as your body is going to get. And the only thing that you might want to do in addition with respect to your lower body posture is just using the muscles in your hips and maybe your psoas muscles a little bit. Try twisting to the left and right. And try and find a place. It's not so much wondering about whether your body is, your upper body is facing forward or not. It's more like you want a orientation of your body that seems to balance the stress on your sort of psoas muscles and upper quads, right? So that there's, often if you're sitting in either Burmese or half lotus, one of these postures where you have one foot in front and one foot in back or something like that, your body can have a kind of inherent twist as a result. This does not happen if you're sitting in a chair, which is good. But so try and balance out that twist and notice what that feels like. There's a whole complicated collection of muscles in there that are all trying to kind of deal with both the twist in your hips and the twist in your knees, basically. So try and settle that out. And then up above that is obviously your upper body and your head, right? So probably the best way to straighten your back, surprisingly, is to lift your chest. So you can imagine that there's a pillar planted in your belly that's very gently supporting your sternum. And just allow your sternum to float up as though helped by that pillar. And you'll notice that what happens if you do that, and this happens almost invariably, whatever your lower body posture is, the muscles in the skin on your upper back and your necks start feeling like they can relax, and they're just sort of falling down towards the base of your spine. And with that, let your head float back and up so that your face falls into a sort of vertical plane with your nose above your navel, your ears kind of directly above your shoulders. The energy in your shoulders should be out. And the canonical mudra, if you want to make it, is you place your left palm on top of your right palm. You bring your thumbs around into a circle, and the contact between your hands and thumbs is very light, and just center that in your lower, it's sort of against your lower abdomen, so that the little fingers of both hands are gently pressed against your lower abdomen, and your thumb tips are at or slightly above the level of your navel. The feeling in your arm should be like you're doing two, single brush stroke ensos, one large circle of your shoulders and one smaller circle inside of your hands. And the space inside your hands, if you play with the height of your mudra, there's a sweet spot where kind of it requires a minimum amount of effort to hold up your hands. And when you find that spot, what often happens is you can feel literally almost immediately feel the space between your hands kind of warm up. So you can kind of explore and see if you can find that spot. And then we sit with our eyes open in the Zen School and our gaze downcast and relaxed, and also very wide in the sense of taking in as much of the periphery as it can accommodate without looking around, basically. So now that you've found your posture, that place where you planted the pillar in your abdomen, right down there at the bottom of your breathing apparatus is this spot called the hara in Japanese. It's dantian, lower dantian in Chinese, right? So put a little tiny bit of tension there, maybe a slight tightening of your lower stomach muscles and maybe the muscles in your pelvic floor. This is like yogic ujjayi breathing, right? And with that, breathe all the way out. The bottom of your breath, pause. And then when your diaphragm says, hey, I want some breath, just let go of the tension and breathe in. Let the breath flood in and fill your body. Breathing through your nose if you can, if you're not stuffed up. And do maybe 3 to 5 more of those. And after that, just let your breath take its natural rate and depth. But keep your attention in your hara. It's as though you're watching your breath with an eye that's planted in your hara. And now I'm going to shut up and we're going to sit a bit. Sorry. We talked about bodily posture, but there's also a kind of mental posture or inner posture. And I didn't talk much about that, so I thought I'd say something about that. Just like your bodily posture, the fundamental requests are to be both upright and also relaxed. Sometimes it can help to adjust your posture so that you're energetically upright, and then relax your whole body just a little bit, just to get a feel for what that's like. The same is true of your mental posture. It's receptive and attentive to whatever is happening right now. And at the same time, relaxed, welcoming, and curious. And there's really nothing we need to do, nowhere we need to go. So just to be really both present with and interested in what happens when we don't have to do anything else. Notice the way thoughts come and go. Sometimes they grab your attention. Sometimes they're just a blip. Sometimes they're like ripples in a pond. Neither of those is better or worse. None of those is better or worse. It's just the nature of human thinking. And be curious about how thoughts come and go and how awareness comes and goes. Sometimes we're richly aware of everything that's going on, and sometimes we're tangled up in some way. To notice that, to be curious about it, and not to be judgmental or evaluative about it. It's okay to be human, basically. It's okay to be human. And that's part of the function of a human mind. It's not the whole thing. So both outer and inner posture, upright, alert, and relaxed, and curious. So let's do this before we, sit down and start talking. Let's stand up and do a little bit of walking. Does that make sense? Just to loosen up our legs. So why don't we all stand in a big circle facing in, maybe stand behind your sabatons or something. Yeah, there you go. And so relax your knees so that your knees are slightly bent. Roll your pelvis forward a little bit so that that supports your back. And then everybody turn to their left. And on the next out breath, move your left foot forward a bit and plant it. And then on the in-breath, start lifting your right foot. Don't lift it off the floor. Just sort of lighten it up. Maybe get up on the ball of the foot. On the next out breath, plant your right foot. And, repeat. All right, that's good. Let's go back to our seats. Mhm. So before we do anything else, does anyone have any questions about sitting, the posture, the what should be going on in your mind, um, the particular approach of Zen, Buddhism in general? Any questions at all? Any or about your particular, um, you know, observations and complaints about sitting and so on and so forth? Anything? Yeah, go ahead.
Could you speak about the throat, jaw, tongue?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. So, when I mentioned that the breathing we were doing was kind of like yogic ujjayi breathing, the difference is that in breathing when you're doing yoga, normally there's a kind of there's a little bit of a lock in the throat. You lock your hara basically, but you also kind of lock your throat. You don't do that when you're sitting, right? Because it actually, if you sit for hour upon hour and you're breathing like this, you're going to wear out your throat. So the throat should feel open and like it's just a wide channel for the breath to pass through, right? In terms of the jaw, when your head is floating up off your shoulders in this way, your face falls into a vertical plane, and your jaw rests on this sort of platform of muscle that runs around under here. And it's good to play with that, you can kind of bounce your jawbone on that platform. It should rest on that platform of muscle in a really relaxed way. If you're crimping your jaw down, after a while it gets uncomfortable in here, basically. And it's also useful to, in line with the sort of balancing thing and getting the twist of your lower body right. There's also a thing you can do with your chin where you sort of get your face into a vertical plane and you're resting you can feel the weight of the front part of your head resting on these muscles here, and then rotate your neck back and forth. And right here in the middle, there's a kind of a detent. It's as though your head drops a little tiny bit and picks up a little bit on the way up. And so that's sort of where your head is centered, just so you know. And that's worth doing. And then the instructions for Zazen written down in the 13th century very specifically say you keep your teeth and lips both gently shut, and you place your tongue against the front roof of your mouth. Interesting thing, I don't know how caffeinated you are, but I drink a fair amount of coffee, and I find that sometimes my when I go to close my teeth, there's a little bounce, like a little jitter in my jaw, and my teeth sometimes clack together and stuff like that. So if that's happening, maybe let your teeth separate a little bit, and then try it again later, because often what happens is it settles down, and then your teeth can be sort of just resting together, and the inside of your mouth is really relaxed. Does that help, or does that cover it all, or did you have some more questions about
I
that?
just find that I have tension in my tongue.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
hard to balance in the way the thumbs are balanced.
Yeah, I would say if you let your jaw close and then just let your tongue relax and let it slide forward and rest against the front roof of your mouth. And if there's tension, no, like bring your attention to that and see if you can explore it, right? Often, generally speaking, when you're sitting and you feel tension or discomfort in your body, the request is to bring your full attention to that place and notice what's happening there. And a number of things can happen. One is that the tension or discomfort can possibly relax a little bit because there's this giant feedback loop running in your body and mind between your sort of proprioception or nociception, right, and your body's efforts to keep itself in a sort of allostatic balance where it's not making too much effort anywhere, right? Because you don't want to you don't want to cramp your muscles or burn up too much energy tightening a particular muscle or something like that. And we can cooperate with that allostatic function by bringing our attention to places that are uncomfortable, basically. And then sometimes you get actually a sort of conceptual insight about what's going on, and then you know more about it and how to work with it and stuff like that. But anyway, yeah. Any other questions?
Why do we keep our eyes open?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, a lot of people meditate with their eyes closed. and that's totally fine, and those people have often have I mean, not every single one of them, but many of them have a completely satisfactory and beneficial sitting practice. There is this particular emphasis in the Zen school on in fact, I was going to talk about this in the talk after this, but I can talk about it now. I mean, if you read the literature of Zen, starting way back before it was even called Zen, right? And maybe even the literature of Mahayana Buddhism, like probably the first manifesto of the Zen school, and it was written down way before anybody was talking about it as Zen, but what became the Zen school, its first manifesto is this thing called in Japanese, it's called the Sandokai, right? In the entire middle of this manifesto, it basically says, the Dharma is the same everywhere, and we all got it from the Buddha in India. and it says, then it briefly says, if you're grasping after things, that's clearly delusion, but also it's not sufficient just to merge with principle or with your idea of the truth, right? And then it launches into this long thing where it talks about engagement with the senses, right? And the entire rest of the body of the document is really about that. And it says, it talks about all the sort of sensory modalities and domains, your taste, touch, object of mind, all the rest of that sort of thing, right? And really the focus in Zazen, as a result of this particular preoccupation that the Zen school has, is almost entirely on the moment-to-moment embodied experience of sitting or walking around or lying down or having a snack, right? And the one of you can enlist your various chunks of sensory hardware in the enterprise of staying close to the the experience of the moment, and the your occipital cortex and the huge portion of it that's given over to visual sensation, like it's got this big like switch in it that says, look, her eyes are open, pay attention. And so
Easier to pay attention.
yeah, exactly. And in particular, to pay attention to the detailed the details of your engagement with the experience of the moment, right? And so, for example, with your visual system, right? I think I've probably talked about this before, but there's 3 major modes of engagement with your visual system, right? There's looking, where you're looking at stuff, right? And usually looking invites some kind of agency, right? It invites thinking and imagining and so on, right? And at very least, it invites recognition and categorization, right? Look, it's a cup. And then there's just seeing, which is this mode that you can drop into where, and it's not that hard to drop into it, but where you're just bringing in light and pattern, and your gaze is relaxed. When your gaze is sufficiently relaxed, particularly if you're staring at a wall, you start to see essentially the structure of your visual system overlaid on top of the patterns and light that are coming in. You see this sort of floaty thing, often blue, but not always, in the middle of your visual field. That's essentially your the place where your optic nerve attaches to your retina, right? And then on the outside of that, there's this sort of highly detailed, fine-grained area, and after that, it gets a little feathery and weird, and then you're way out here at the periphery, and you're it gets out to about there, right? So that's what happens when you're just taking in the raw bits of your visual data, and when your gaze is relaxed. So it's not jumping around the room going, oh, look at that, or trying to construct a scene. It's just settled here, right? So that's just seeing. And then the other one is like not seeing, and not seeing is what we do when we're clearly sensing the world, but very little of that sensation is arising into our perception because we're preoccupied with something else. Like, we can be, it's interesting. You can be not seeing because you're currently preoccupied with hearing, for example, right? You can be not seeing because usually seeing swamps to things like, taste and smell, but you can be not seeing because you're fully involved in sensing your body, right? Or because you're tangled up in thinking, right? And so, and those 3 modes can kind of act as indicators around what the details of our engagement are with the world, right? So anyway, that's why. Yeah. What else? What time is it? Cool. So the last N talks I've given, I've gotten way out down in the weeds, talking about koans in the Blue Cliff Record, and there's a copy out on the coffee table, so anyone can pick it up and look at it. So I thought I would jump up a few levels to the sort of I don't know, I don't know how many feet it is. 20. The 20-foot level, and kind of talk about why any of this is a good idea in the first place, right? Like, ever since we've had any notion of what people were concerned about, so once they started writing stuff down, right, and it survived sufficiently long that we could get a sense of it, it's pretty clear that people have been really worried, to say the least, and puzzled by why human life is so messy and has this underlying quality of dissatisfaction, right? And two great examples, really early literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? So there's a scene in the Epic of Gilgamesh where Gilgamesh is in a bar and he's talking to the bartender, who happens to be a woman, and she says, "Gilgamesh, give it a rest. Okay, go home, relax, hang out with your family. Stop thrashing about." And Gilgamesh says, "No, I have to go do this thing." And he goes off on this quest, and he just makes a terrible mess of everything, right? And it's like, in the end, Gilgamesh does okay, but he really makes a mess of things, right? And does a lot of unnecessary fighting and killing and so on and so forth. And then there's the Odyssey, right? So the Odyssey begins with this scene where Zeus and Athena are hanging around, and Zeus says, "I really hate these humans. We give them free will. We give them this marvelous planet, and then they mess everything up and they blame us, the gods. I think we should kill all of them and start over again." I mean, presumably with banana slugs or something like that, right? And Athena goes, "Oh no, they're not so bad. And look, there's this Odysseus guy," and it sort of goes on from there, right? But that's a pretty scathing indictment of humanity, right? And so people have been both concerned about it and puzzling about why and how to fix it, right? And a lot of the early explanations had to do with something about the spirit world, right? The world is full of inimical, or at least not particularly friendly, spirits that have their nature spirits and other spirits that have their own concerns and really don't have our best interests at heart, right? And are powerful, right? And so need propitiation and constant informing about what we're going to do. Okay, spirits. When I was a kid, I was completely convinced that our house was haunted for a number of reasons, mainly that had to do with some experiences I had when we first moved into it, right? And this lasted for a really long time. And I lived in this house up until I was in high school, basically the first year of high school. And I would come home. I was sort of a latchkey kid, so I would come home. The house would be completely empty, and it was a big, big old house, right? One of the reasons why I thought it might be haunted. And And I would look around, and then I'd go and I'd lie down in the middle of the living room floor, and I'd say, okay, ghosts, if you want to come out, now might not be a bad time. Maybe we can meet, right? And I would lie there as long as I could, and I usually lasted about 37 seconds. Then I would get up and flee the house and go over to my neighbor's house and watch TV, because that was about as much um, to like engagement with the spirit world as I could stand, right? But over time, those explanations and solutions started to seem increasingly unsatisfactory. And in the kind of 500 BC zone, right? It seems like they became unsatisfactory pretty much all over what we know of as the civilized world at the time. So China, India, Central Asia, the Near East, and Anatolia, and to a certain extent Greece, right? All of a sudden, there was this tremendous cultural ferment, and people were re-engaging with the question of why people are so messed up, and proposing solutions, and philosophizing in various ways, and so on. And you see it in pre-Socratic philosophy, you see it in Taoism, Confucianism, and in India you see the yoga schools, a whole bunch of philosophical schools, and then also Buddhism, right? And the Buddha's explanation and proposed solution, it's not exactly unique, but it's pretty unique, actually. And it basically goes like this. And he explains this in the story of the life of the Buddha. He explains this in this after he wakes up. He doesn't think he can explain it to anybody, so he's just like, I'm gonna sit back down again and relax, right? And all these people and spirits and gods and all these other beings come to him and say, no, you have to go explain this to people. So he calls up his old friends in the who are in the ascetic practices and mendicant hermit business, and that's about 5 guys show up, and they're all sitting around, and he explains. He says, life is suffering, right? And they're like, yeah. And he says, and here's why. And this is the unique part. He basically says, so in the talk that he delivers on that day, he just says it sort of arises from the way we engage in delusive grasping and aversion. But if you analyze the Pali Canon, the huge pile of documents that this particular one is a part of, you realize that what he's saying actually is that life is suffering for humans exactly because of all the things that make us human, basically, right? That's what it comes down to, right? Our language, our capacity for planning, and our really, really unbelievably complicated sociology, right? Sociality, sorry. And all of those things fix it so that we have to imagine a independent, separate self and we have to constantly narrate and prop up and animate that self in the world. We have to engage in at least the little tiny shred of free will and agency that we have in a way that's sort of purpose driven and so on, right? And that applies to all of the the activities that we engage in as humans. Again, the sociality, the planning, the speaking, the listening, all the rest of that sort of stuff, right? And you can see why that's a problem, right? If you have a bunch of humans all standing around and they all have this self-construct that they're constantly narrating, and this guy's self-construct says, I want to eat that papaya for breakfast, and this guy's self-construct also says, I want to eat that papaya for breakfast. You have conflict, right? And it just gets worse from there. And then the other issue is that we're constantly in the context of trying to live a fundamentally successful life where we get enough to eat, we have people to hang out with, we can maybe have kids or something like that, right? We're constantly evaluating and judging ourselves and our position in the world and the activities that we're engaging in and so on, right? So it's a mess, right? And he says that's why we suffer. It's because of all the things that make us human. And let's be clear, the things that make us human are also kind of great, right? Like we wouldn't be able to write poetry if we didn't have all those things, and we wouldn't be interested in writing poetry either, right? And we wouldn't, have iPhones and so on. All of that stuff is marvelous, and people do wonderful things with their human capacities, but those capacities run all the time, and they're not always they don't always make us feel good, basically, right? And some people have that worse than others, but some people, a lot of people, are really run over and beat up by their human capacities, right? And we all are to a certain extent. I mean, I got into Buddhist practice largely because, well, two reasons. One, my mom was a Zen student in the late 60s and early 70s. But also after, sleeping on that for 20 years or something like that, I did this thing where I made a bulleted list that described my life, hand bulleted, right? And held it up and was like, this is my ideal life, right? And then I also was observing on a kind of day-to-day basis what it was like for me to be living that life. And I realized I was totally screwing it up and I was miserable at it and I was being a jerk to everybody, right? And I thought, wow, that's really bad. So, and because of my previous experience with my mom being a Zen student and my dad also being involved for a while with Tibetan Buddhism, and my mom dragging me to, zazen at 5 a.m. sometimes, and so on and so forth, I kind of thought that maybe the place to go would be the Zen School, and it's been great, right? It turns out that it offers this practice that allows you to stand close enough to the processes that we're talking about that that cause human suffering, and study them carefully enough so that you start to see the way they're surrounded by a completely different mode of engagement and mode of being, right? That has nothing to do with categorizing, judging, measuring, animating the self in the world, and so on and so forth, and is mostly engaged in a kind of unconditioned appreciation of just the act of being alive, basically. And that when in the instructions for Zazen that were written down in the 13th century by the founder of Japanese Soto Zen, he says the sitting like this is actually, he says, it's the Dharma gate of ease and joy. Yeah, and it is, right? It doesn't mean that you're never uncomfortable. It doesn't even mean that you never suffer. It just means that you have this other mode at your disposal that acts as a counterweight and an aid to living comfortably and skillfully with whatever version of the human condition you have, right? And that's pretty good. So does anybody have any questions about that or thoughts, or what do you think?
What do you think separates Zen from other schools of Buddhism?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it's mostly this preoccupation with staying, well, I'll back up and put it another way. By the time Zen arose, there were a lot of different Buddhist schools, right? And many of them were concerned with carrying forward the teachings of the Buddha, where teachings of the Buddha either means this massive like pile of texts that I mentioned earlier called the Pali Canon, which is the canon that's written in this invented language called Pali, which was essentially designed to be chanted, recited, and studied, right? And is really the province of the sort of Theravadan schools, the primary Buddhist schools in Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, and so on, right? And then there's the Mahayana school, which also claims to have the teachings of the Buddha, although, somebody was making something up along the way, right? Clearly, but in any case, all of those texts are claim to recount particular acts of teaching and demonstrating of the Dharma by the Buddha, basically, and in a lot of Buddhist schools, the focus is on studying and reciting in a devotional way those texts, basically, right? And learning, and the idea is that by studying and learning the words of the Buddha, eventually you understand enough about the way things work that you're free, basically. And there's actually there's a really excellent essay in the Pali Canon called something like, it's generally referred to as the benefits of the contemplative life. And he talks exactly about practice. And he says, you conform to the precepts. And so after a while, you get this sort of pleasure and delight from living a life that's fundamentally blameless, marvelous, right? And then you meditate and you move your consciousness through these various states, the jhanas, and eventually your sort of at least your meditation practice is sort of blissful, and over time you clean your karma enough, and then you're out of here, basically, right? After you die, right? When Buddhism landed in China, all that stuff was fine for a while, but after a while, people wanted to be talking about essentially contemporary teachers, right? And so they invented this way of justifying that by saying that there's this lineage of, and this was particularly a preoccupation of the Zen school, lineage of teachers starting from actually the prehistorical mythical Buddhas through the historical Buddha and up through India and then China and then, and then elsewhere. For example, I learned this lineage in Japan, where I'm not in Japan, from Japanese Zen, where there's a whole bunch of teachers, Japanese teachers in the lineage. So the idea is that literally the mind of awakening itself was transmitted all down that chain to the present day, right? And so the underlying tenets of the Zen school are two. They're, one, all the useful and transformative transmissions of the Dharma happen in the context of relationships, right? So that's one. So it's not from reading, it's not from studying, it's not from chanting, it's from meeting people and expressing the Dharma together, basically. So that's one. And then the other one is that the primary practice in order to enable this is pointing at the mind, right? And so those are the axioms, right? And when you read the literature, there's a, in the middle of this lineage, right? There's this guy that supposedly, this mythical character who supposedly brought Buddhism from India. He was actually, if he was a historical figure, he actually lived in what's now Pakistan. But in any case, brought this particular way of thinking about Buddhism to China, right? And his name is Bodhidharma, right? He's kind of famous, right? And he's also credited with inventing Chinese martial arts, right? But one of the standard questions in the Buddhist literature is, what's the meaning of Bodhidharmas coming from the West? And invariably in the stories where somebody asks that question, the response is something about Zazen, right? So basically, what the main focus of Zen is sitting Zazen, and so, for example, when one of the stories, this guy and this monk who's not named in the stories, asked two really famous teachers, what's the meaning of Bodhidharmas coming from the West? And in the first case, the teacher says, oh, hand me that zafu over there. And he grabs his zafu, gives it to the teacher, and the teacher whacks it with it. Right? And then he asked again, so another teacher, was this teacher who's even more famous for whacking. He asked him the question. He asked him the question, and the teacher, this guy Linji, says, "Oh, that's my meditation brace over there. Will you hand me that, please?" And meditation brace is a stick that has a little platform on top of it. You can rest your hands on it and sleep while you're meditating, or it helps hold you up or something like that. And it's probably very hard and painful to be hit with it, but Linji hits him with it, right? So in other words, it's about zazen, right? So all Dharma transmission happens in relationship, sometimes in relationship between people and things, but mostly between people and people, right? Or people and other sentient beings like cows, right? And then pointing at the mind and doing it in the context of a lot of seated meditation, basically. And that's the difference between the Zen school and all the other schools, as far as I can tell. I mean, pretty much all of the Buddhist schools are engaged in some meditative practice some of the time, right? And to be perfectly fair the other way, have you ever spent any time at a Zen temple or monastery? Yeah. They do a lot of chanting and devotional practice, right? You spend a lot of time chanting sutras and stuff like that. So it's a mix, but the focus in the Zen school is on is not directly on textual study and chanting and devotional practice. The primary devotional practice is Zazen, basically. So anyway, what else? Oh my God. We nailed it. It's 8:30. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. It was great. I enjoyed it a lot. So thanks. Yeah.